Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club with myself, Father Fessio, Vivian Dudro here at Ignatius Press, and Joseph Pearce. We continue to discuss In Defense of Sanity, the best essays of G.K. Chesterton. And we had to proceed without Vivian last week, but now that she's back, we'll be fully informed. And we're going to continue with a chapter on the instability of the state compared to the family, basically. Starts on page 246. Vivian, Joseph, anything you want to say to lead off?
I will defer to the lady, and welcome back, Vivian.
Thank you. Well, he's starting out here talking about Herr Hitler again. I think you two must have talked about him last time.
We did.
And he's talking about a problem that we have in our own time, and that is fake news. How do you tell the difference between real news and fake news? Or maybe it's not even so great a dichotomy as that, but just trying to filter through all the information to try to get at what's really real. And he starts out by explaining that in his own time, the different statements in the news about Hitler almost lead the superstitious to suppose that there are two Hitlers because there are two contradictory visions of him. And he goes on to further describe, this is page 246 in the middle. On the one side, it would really seem that the German dictator is concerned to restore the sane and solid status of the family. And what are the statements that would lead to that belief? He talks about, meaning Hitler, talks about a woman being able to fulfill herself in the personal relation, meaning in the family, that she doesn't need to find her freedom and fulfillment simply by working for money. He put in a word for large families, and so on. And however, Chesterton perceives, and this is 1934, he perceives through the propaganda, and at this time there was a lot of Nazi propaganda, all these posters of these beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed families, happy women, happy strong men, happy children. And Chesterton sees through this propaganda and perceives that there's a dark side to it, and that is eugenics. The talk of this is the bottom of 246, the talk of compulsory action to keep the breed in a certain state of bestial excellence. And he goes on to explain that this also is coming out of Germany. And as we know, in hindsight, that was in fact the true face of Nazism. That was, in fact, the truth behind the propaganda. And once again, Chesterton is the genius to see through to the truth. And I'll just leave it there.
I think that the key thing there is that you have the front, you have the spin, you have the fake news, and then you have the reality. And I think one of the things we really need to look at from the perspective of the world in which we find ourselves, we seem to be now living in an age, seems to be made even worse by the COVIDious circumstances, where we A, believe in the power of the state to solve big problems, and B, believe in the power of scientism to do likewise. And then we have this sort of alliance now between a big government, big brother state, and big science coming together to solve all the problems, and the rest of us just have to sort of be compliant. And what he sees here for all this, doesn't matter what all the talk is, if the state has power over the family, we are living in a tyranny. that you only actually have freedom if the family is at the root and at the heart and at the foundation of society. All talk that seeks to hide that reality is basically pernicious. And Nazi Germany, they were compulsorily sterilizing Untermenschen, those that were not of the bestial excellence. They were exterminating children and adults with Down syndrome. So you have all of the front, perfect families with lots of perfect kids. But the point is, in the end, the state decides who's perfect. And if you're not perfect, then you're disposable. And that's basically, this is the situation we find ourselves now. Big government, big science, coming together, eugenics. It's all been done before, and we're just not learning the lessons.
Do you think maybe mandating vaccines for 5-year-olds might have any connection with what we saw in Germany?
Yeah, I think the danger, regardless of the science, right? And I don't really want to get involved in that, not least because I'm not a scientist. The danger is once the federal government, once the big power at the center of the state can decide what every member of this society has to do, and it's mandated by law, then it might begin. So I always know that hard cases might make bad law, even if it could be seen to be bona fide in this one case. Once the precedent is established, the state has the right to do that and can ride roughshod over the family. And again, to go back to what Chesterton says here, it is by definition the taking away from the family of the decisions that ought to belong to the family. And that, I think, it encapsulates the current situation we're in, as well as the situation in Nazi Germany. And the parallels between the two, quite frankly, are scary.
And we have another analogy to this in the public education system. And obviously, there's a value to a country, a nation, a society which has some cohesion to make sure that all its future citizens are well educated and have access to the origin of their country and what the principles are and so on. But once you got the state overriding parents, in education, then the opportunity for more propaganda is there, and the worst kind of propaganda, because I don't mind propaganda as much because I think I can spot it pretty well. But I had an education which was classical, liberal, and taught critical thinking, truly critical thinking. I think I can sift and discern for myself. But if you subject a young to what is basically propaganda, then you're taking away a lot of their defenses. Now, of course, the beautiful thing about this is that at the heart of it all is God's given us reason and a human heart. And so no amount of propaganda or malformation of the youth will be able to eradicate that, although they do the best job they can.
Yeah, I think what happens in the end, of course, the reason conforms to nature and to the God of nature. And if the Irish saying that he who bites the rock of Peter breaks his teeth, but he who bites the rock of reality breaks his teeth. So the point is, if we defy reason, we will just end up with a complete mess of a society, lots of broken lives, lots of dead people. It's happened in the past with the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution and with the rise of the Nazis, and it might happen again. But at the end of the day, reality reimposes itself because, nature is the only sustainable form of reality.
Yes, there's a wonderful Catholic doctor, Jewish convert, who made famous the expression, I'm not sure if he invented it, but made it famous, God always forgives, man sometimes forgives, nature never forgives. You can't resist nature for too long. I want to go back to the very beginning, though, of the chapter, because he's got one of his paradoxical sayings there. He says, the foreign news, which comes us by the newest and most scientific methods of communication, is much more confusing than it was when it was merely gossip. good communications corrupt good manners. That's the paradox. Good communications corrupt good manners. Now, what does that mean? Well, I can verify that in what we're doing now with social media and Twitter. We have good scientific instantaneous communications, but what does it do? It seems to be an almost irresistible temptation to profanity, obscenity, lack of civil discourse, anybody having an opinion, as if it's as good as anyone else's. I do think that with all the possible good that comes from some of these technological advances, the dangers are real.
Yeah, I think actually this is not just paradoxical, but actually prophetic of our own time. Good communications corrupt good manners, because in the old days when you're writing a letter, someone sent you a letter, it might have irritated you, annoyed you immensely, right? You sit down immediately in your anger and you start composing the letter. Well, you've got plenty of time to change your mind. You've got to put it in an envelope. You've got to stamp it. You've got to walk to the post office. There's going to be nothing rash happening. Whereas now someone can say something that annoys you and irritates you. You write a quick response, which maybe lacks charity and reason, and hit the send button. It's gone. Right? It's a perfect example of how this good communication has corrupted good manners. We have no time now to think twice before we respond.
I think this statement also is a little more directly related to gossip. In other words, good communication, even without technology, if you're going to be forthright and transparent and bring it out all in the open and whatever, you're likely going to harm the reputation of other people. That's why gossip is a sin. And, you think about the very first telephones were party lines. There was never more gossip than that era of the party line telephone. Everybody was listening to everybody else's phone calls and then reporting to one another what everybody else was saying about everybody else. Gossip proliferated with the telephone.
But he seems to be kind of giving a positive valence to gossip here. It's much more confusing.
Well, if you want to interpret it that way, feel free.
But I think part of the thing here is gossip is between you and me, and we're looking at each other. We may be talking with someone else, but
it's human scale. It's not mass scale. It's not global. That basically you gossip about your neighbor. You don't gossip about everything else that's going on in the world, which we're now able to do because of so-called good communication. And again, this whole idea of good, right? What's good? Does good mean just if it's efficient and effective, therefore it's good, or is there actually a moral, ethical component to what is good? In which case, we should be questioning some of these advances, some of these progresses.
Yes, indeed. I would like to go back to two other things that you said, if I may. Joseph mentioned this double movement between science and government, right? Between, like we have a technocracy basically right now. But there is the component of the democracy in that it's when people demand of government to do these things for them. All this demand for rights, for example, we end up with fewer rights because we end up with more government intervention in order to supposedly protect these rights and create these rights and so on, right? So there is a dimension of people demanding, we want better lives, we want better health care, we want a right to health care, we want this, we want that. So when he talks about the state of families in the city on page 248,
yes.
Tenants failing to pay their rent, slums being condemned, husband and wives wandering off, separation, divorce, and so on, and saying that this image of social disorder inviting a government response, right? The family looks frail, he says, in this kind of world. And so there is then this demand for the government to do something. And so I'll leave that. I see Joseph wants to say something to that, and I'll let him in a second. But I also wanted to relate it to Father's comment about vaccines. You might not be aware that we have had compulsory vaccines for 5-year-olds for decades, ever since the polio vaccines were mandated that you had to have a vaccine in order to send those children to school.
Yes.
And here's a perfect example of the people wanting better life through science, right? Health through science, whatever. And the government, okay, we can accomplish this by making school children get vaccinated. Now the list of vaccines, it's this long. It's measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, tetanus, polio. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And we've all been signing off on this for decades, since I was a child. So,
but there have been, you couldn't get exemptions to that. There were exemptions, the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, but also those are, number one, they were actually vaccines. They prevented infection. Number two, they were tested. They were safe.
Well, I'm not,
effective.
I think that's a digression from the simple point that I'm making, that parents being compelled to give their children shots by the government has been going on for years and years, since I was 5 years old. That's all I'm saying. And that's all.
Okay.
I agree, and I don't want to follow the digression because but I don't know for certain. But my wife Susanna thinks it might be more than a coincidence that our son, who was born with Down syndrome but was not born with autism, developed autism within weeks of getting the MMR shot. And I know the science behind it. I'm not speaking dogmatically, definitively. The point is that we have vaccines being produced in a panic situation with mega billion-buck profits at stake, and then they're imposed and mandated within a year. To me, there's a truth in literature that you could see it happening. Please God, it's not going to happen now. That there's some hideous side effects, as there was, for instance, with the children that had thalidomide, right? That there's hideous side effects, and it's mandated that everybody. And you've basically managed to wreck and ruin a whole generation because of a rash judgment by a big government that was overreaching its rights.
Right. Well, I'm saying that overreach started a long time ago.
Yes.
What really brought to my attention when I started homeschooling my kids here in the state of California, and when I had to get the forms to get permission from the state to do this. I who was a product of public education, when we were growing up, nobody questioned public education, nobody questioned polio vaccines, nobody questioned a lot of things that were already by then part of American life. And it's not until you step outside that box, and I saw the paperwork I had to fill out to get permission from the state to educate my children, right? Okay. This already my eyes were opened to how this thing had already been turned around, and that the family had already been in so many ways displaced by state authority.
I don't want to play tennis. I'm not actually disagreeing with you at all. But when I say I don't want to play tennis, I mean that, that leaving Father Fessio out of the conversation. Not that Father Fessio can't look after himself, but I'm going. I'm going to be quiet. Going to let Father Fessio have the next word. But I do have something else I'd like to say. But I'll let Father Fessio.
Well, I did this. I mean, because I don't disagree with anything anyone said so far. I mean, I think
right.
it's all it all describes what we've experienced. But I want to just zero in a bit on what he gives us the reason for this. Why does the family seem frail compared to the state? Why is there a desire to have the state come in? He says on 248, and you mentioned part of it, Vivian, the big fundamental fact, which the big cities have fancied to be a paradox, the big cities had this notion for a perfectly simple reason. But in the modern moment in which they lived, and especially in an industrial country like ours, the framework of the state did really look stronger than the framework of the family. It goes on below. In those conditions, the family seemed the frailest thing in the world, and the state the strongest thing in the world. But it is not really so. So he's talking about, especially late 1800s and late 1900s with the Industrial Revolution and what happened with the factories and urbanization and, loss of the family because you moved to the cities. And then you had to have, social safety nets, that sort of thing.
And health policies and Ellis Island to test people before they even came over here. And I mean, and yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, so the one thing, I mean, the background to all this, that Vivian says we've signed off on this for decades, which we have. But the reason actually that Chesterton and Belloc turned against the Liberal Party was because the Liberal Party, its advocacy of the welfare state, of that basically that national insurance where everybody has to pay a certain amount in to the government, so the government will guarantee their pensions. Because what does the government do? The government spends all that money today, so the money's not there when you need it. So it's not, it's like giving taking out an insurance policy with someone who's going to squander your money today and hope that they've still got it from somebody else when you need it. So the whole point is for them is and also the education bills of the Liberal government of the early decades of the first decade of the 20th century, overriding religious liberty and the right of independent Catholic schools to have their own way of education. This is what actually turned Chesterton and Belloc away from the Liberal Party, because they could see the embryonic socialism of this big welfare state. So this is really and this is obviously 30 years, 25 years after that, when he's talking about how this has gone even further. But I mean, again, if I can just read it, because this is just get back to first principles. This is page 247. There are certain sayings which for the last 100 years or so have not been considered quite respectable because they were religious, or perhaps connected with a sort of religion that was not quite respectable. One of these statements is this: the family comes first. It comes before the state. Its authority and necessity are anterior to those of the state. And then this always sounded perfectly horrid to rows and rows of earnest young people learning statistics for Fabian socialism at the London School of Economics. To that type, to that generation, the state was everything. That great official machine which managed the traffic and took over the telephone system was the very cosmos in which these people lived. I mean, it's an alternative religion.
And
that the state can solve all problems if you give it the power to do so.
And I was only pointing out that this cosmos he's describing also describes perfectly modern America for since the day I was born. I was born into this cosmos. That's what modern America has been for decades. And he's exactly right. But of course, the genius to this whole chapter is not stating the obvious, but that he actually says the unobvious thing, which is this, that the state is what's unstable. That's the title of this chapter, the instability of the state. In spite of this huge, impressive cosmos of science and technology and modern states, he says that the state is inherently unstable and that man, on page 249, cannot really refer the daily domestic problems of his life to the state that may be turned upside down every 24 hours. He must, in fact, fall back on that primal and prehistoric institution, the fact that he has a mate, they have a child, and the three must get on together somehow under whatever law or lawlessness they are supposed to be living. And that's exactly what we're seeing people do before our very eyes.
Getting on with it.
Homeschooling, growing vegetables, making beer, whatever it is that they're doing. They're realizing, I can't save this thing, this monstrous modern society that we have. I can't save it. I can't fix it. I don't even know if it is fixable. But I'll tell you one thing I can do. I can take care of my family. And that's what we're seeing people do.
Yes. But what happens when the state becomes so either powerful, influential that, for example, in China, as they did, but no longer, they say, we don't want families. You can only have one child, which is barely a family. And in this country, the state has done everything to support destroying children, and divorce, contraception, abortion, you want to get rid of a family, well, that'll do it pretty well. So,
but Father, this proves Chesterton's point about the instability of the state, because if you have a one-child policy, you have an imploding population, and within two generations, you do not have a country. So the point is that the Chinese, the only two ways you get out of that: either realize it was a stupid idea, or you've got to allow massive immigration to provide for the missing people.
And to their credit. And to their credit, yes, they've reversed the policy.
Right. Well, they say to their credit, it is absolutely inexorable that they had no choice.
Right.
And rudimentary mathematics could have told them that before they even instituted the policy. I mean,
yes.
Yes. Once again, Chesterton has nourished and encouraged clear thinking. I think we can probably finish the next chapter in a few minutes, or maybe not, but it's called The Romance of Childhood, where I first, when I read it, I just put 2 question marks after in the chapter, saying, what is this all about? I reread it, and as often happens when I reread Chesterton, I do get it, and he rarely says something which is not worth coming back to and penetrating a little bit more deeply. But I would still prefer you to talk about it.
Maybe Joseph would like to start.
Well, I've got one section that I've highlighted and may or may not read, but towards the bottom of page 252, I love the fact that Chesterton uses the term self-limitation. So at the beginning of that paragraph there, this game of self-limitation is one of the secret pleasures of life. The phrase self-limitation is at the very core of everything Solzhenitsyn stands for. That basically, as individuals and as states and as cultures, we have to practice self-limitation. If we don't practice self-limitation, we're doomed. And so the fact that Chesterton talks about this here, and then the real paradox of this whole essay is that the paradox: happiness is wanting less. If we could just actually want less, we'd be happier and we'd live in a happier society. But we live in a society that's trying to convince us we always want more, and unless we have more, we are unhappy. And until that is reversed, we're on the road to ruin.
Okay, and that's one level of limitation, is wanting less. There's another level, or another dimension of it, which is less intuitive. And I ask you this question: Did you two, when you were children, did you ever just spontaneously decide to skip the lines on the sidewalk or skip every other paver as you walked? Did you ever do that?
Yes, we actually had a nursery rhyme that went with it. Step on a crack, you'll break your mother's back. Yeah, we all did that as kids.
And that music, that game, which I assume I know you have over here as well, it might not be called by the same name, Hopscotch. That's exactly what Hopscotch is. You actually draw out limits, and you have to skip and hop and skip and hop and avoid the one that's got the stone in, change.
And avoid the lines. Can't step on the lines.
Exactly, can't stop on the lines. Yeah, this is actually one of the oldest, most natural children's games there are.
But Chesterton seems to think that somehow that imposing artificial limits is something which is more human and leads to greater happiness.
Yeah, but the important thing is, of course, self-limitation. We are choosing to impose the limits. We're not having the limits imposed upon us by an outside party. And I think that's the crucial difference. Happiness is wanting less, not getting less.
And I think
even when we do impose it, so why should I impose on myself not stepping on the cracks? That limits my ability to go places. I can go places, but it limits my freedom, so to speak. Well, why should I do that?
Well, I think psychologically, the reason why children do this, I'm just throwing this out there. I haven't conducted a study, okay? But children are always being limited by the people around them. You're a child, your parents are going to tell you what to do, your teachers are going to tell you what to do. You're constantly being told what to do, where and what and how all day long. And I think one of the ways the child grows in a kind of inner freedom is to start making limits for himself. These aren't what my parents are telling me to do, or my teachers, or the bully on the street, my big brother. I'm going to make this limit for myself. And there's a kind of satisfaction in creating a limit for yourself and seeing if you can do it. Seeing if you can play that hopscotch, seeing if you can get the ball into that hoop over there, and so on. I think there's something psychologically freeing, paradoxically, by imposing a limit on yourself. And I think an adult equivalent of this is going camping. Why? Here you have all the comforts of home, right? Electricity and running water and all these things. And you deliberately go onto a pile of dirt and set up a campsite and starting hauling water from a river and all the rest of it. Why would you do such a thing? There's something incredibly romantic about this kind of, let me see how little I can live with. Let me see just how free I really am without these things. And when he uses these 3 stories as his examples of this, Robinson Crusoe, Treasure Island, and Noah's Ark on 252, what are those but stories of living within the limits? Even though Robinson Crusoe was shipwrecked, he didn't choose to be shipwrecked, but he made a romance out of it. Like, how many things can I do with this piece of string? Chesterton called this the romance of thrift.
Yes.
And Treasure Island. It's interesting that all 3 of these things involve ships, because as a person who grew up on boats, my father was a yacht racer. We grew up on boats, and one of the most romantic things about being on a boat was how little you could take with you when you went on board, was how little this tiny little galley was, and you had to figure out how to cook, and all these little cupboards. I don't know if you've ever been on a German World War II submarine. It's absolutely charming. All this woodwork cabinetries, all these tiny little cubbies. It's a master of organization and efficiency with little. There's something freeing about this, ironically.
That, Solzhenitsyn's novella, One Day in Life of Ivan Denisovich, is all about that. Is how do you actually get in touch with your humanity when you're living in something which is trying to deprive you of it? And you do it by actually embracing the limits, by being happy in wanting less, by actually having a sacramental experience when you're eating the rotten prison food. Every single bite becomes a prayer. So when people try to take freedom away from you, you actually attain your freedom by embracing the less that you have.
Well, this is wonderful, and I probably should let it end here. However, I do want to attempt to go even deeper, briefly. How can you paint a portrait with no lines and no frame? The universe is yours. Wait a minute, I want to draw a picture. So I'm going to make Thomas is telling us it's time.
Freudian. It was a Freudian.
That's fine. That's
No,
fine.
there was a total.
I'll leave it with that. I think any concluding remarks, our technician is shutting us down. All right. We'll see you all back next week at the Forum Book Club, where we'll continue with this fascinating author, George Gilbert Keith Chesterton.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.